Citizens Climate Lobby Great Lakes Region Virtual Conference. I'm Elizabeth Dell, Great Lakes co-coordinator, joining you this afternoon from Traverse City, Michigan. Regrettably, my dear friend and co-coordinator John Sabin from Oberlin, Ohio is not able to be here today due to a family emergency, and he is very missed. We're wishing John and his family all the best. I have some quick housekeeping before we get started. After this first session ends at 5 minutes to the hour, we'll have a 15-minute break. If you live in Indiana, you will stay on this line for all of today's sessions, so no need to disconnect during the break. If you live in Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, or Wisconsin, you will use a different Zoom line for the state breakouts, which begin at 2:10 Eastern Time. The state Zoom line links are in the emails that were sent yesterday and this morning, but we'll also post those in the chat near the end of the session, which will allow you to simply click on the appropriate link and join the next session directly. After the state breakouts, please return to this Zoom line, and then you'll have 15 minutes to stretch your legs before our closing plenary, which we're really excited about. Tia Nelson and Bob Inglis will be here for a conversation about building bridges for climate solutions. It will be moderated by Madeline Para, CCL's Vice President of Programs, who will also give our closing remarks. So on behalf of John Sabin and myself, I would like to offer our deep appreciation to the conference planning team: Jess Wilbur, Catherine Garten, Clara Fang, Deirdre Courtney, Peter Bogart, Todd McGill, and Linda Racine. Their input, ideas, and support over the course of our planning, including transitioning from an in-person event to a virtual event, have been invaluable. Additionally, we have a number of volunteers, including several CCL campus leaders and regional fellows, providing tech support today and tomorrow during some workshops that we're offering. So many thanks to all of you. We also want to acknowledge another special group of people that are essential to the Great Lakes region, our state coordinators. And give me just a moment, please. I want to let you see their faces. These folks are really invaluable to John and me. They support our group leaders and liaisons. They plan state strategy and provide volunteers with the training and tools they need to build political will for effective climate legislation. They, along with the 160 plus group leaders in the region, keep things on track and moving forward. John and I love working with them, and we're grateful for their many contributions. So cheers to our state coordinators and to all of our group leaders as well. So we have a surprise addition to our program today. Indiana Senator Mike Braun and co-founder of the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus recorded a video message for us.
Hello, Senator Mike Braun here. I'd like to thank the Citizens Climate Lobby for giving me the opportunity to say a few words to this Great Lakes Regional Conference about my work on the Growing Climate Solutions Act and the importance of bipartisan leadership on climate issues. Last year, I co-founded the Climate Solutions Caucus with Delaware Senator Chris Coons, a bipartisan group of senators who believe Congress should play a central role in guiding America's 21st century energy economy and addressing the challenge of a changing climate. Our caucus seeks to take the politics out of this important issue. Instead, members will commit to an honest dialogue through which we can develop solutions that solidify American environmental leadership, promote American workers, and make meaningful progress on protecting our environment. Recently, my focus on this issue has been on my Growing Climate Solutions Act, a bill to break down barriers for farmers and foresters to participate in carbon markets and be rewarded for their climate-smart practices. It can be difficult to get Washington to agree on anything, so I'm especially proud that the Growing Climate Solutions Act has real bipartisan support here in the Senate, as well as the support of such organizations as the National Farm Bureau, National Farmers Union, the Environmental Defense Fund, McDonald's, Microsoft, and over 40 farm groups. Most importantly for me, I've received great support on the bill from Hoosier farmers I speak to while traveling Indiana. CCL volunteers can help by voicing their support for innovative, industry-led solutions like the Growing Climate Solutions Act and encouraging their representatives to get behind it. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few words today. I look forward to working with all of you to find climate solutions that bring together industry, farmers, and both sides of the aisle. Take care.
Great, thank you. We were really happy to have Senator Braun provide that message for us. The Growing Climate Solutions Act has really opened up conversations with Republican members of Congress in our region. And we are very fortunate to have Senator Braun, as well as Michigan's Senator Debbie Stabenow leading on this bill. And now it is my pleasure to welcome our fearless leader and master of efficiency, CCL's Executive Director, Mark Reynolds. When we asked Mark if he'd make a video for the conference or join us live, he replied, "Love to join live," followed by 61 exclamation points. So Mark, thank you very much for being here today.
Great. Elizabeth, thank you so much. And the reason that Elizabeth said master of efficiency, because she asked me to cover like 600 things in 7 minutes. So Elizabeth, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so happy to be here, and it's so amazing seeing all your faces. I just can't wait until we get a chance to get back together live. You know, I loved the Great Lakes Regional Conferences. Some of you were at that Christian retreat center that we went to in Northern Illinois that was so dark at night. You'd always wonder if people would find their way back from their cabin. And then in the morning, everybody be there in the mess hall. And then they'd make that announcement every morning saying, okay, we're going to start with everybody getting your 3 meats. And there'd be this really delightful giggle that would go through the room because, you know, probably half the people were either vegan or vegetarian. It was just delightful to say, start with your 3 meats. Anyway, I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. So I just want to touch on a few things that we're working on as priorities at this point. We're trying to map out every possible election scenario, including a contested election, to see that so that we have a planned response, so that we're not just reacting to a situation, but trying to think through every possible scenario with the House, the Senate, and the presidency. You know, we want to make sure that we have a strong response no matter what situation we're actually in when the dust settles. We're also working to make sure that a price is part of any climate package next year. We're doing that by asking people who are existing sponsors to agree to co-sponsor again next year, trying to get a companion bill in the Senate, and then working hard on the endorser side. We're running at about 80 endorsers new a month right now, which is a really great clip. But also we're asking people who have endorsed to make additional statements, and a lot of you have been successful with that, so we really, really appreciate it. I want us to also just touch on the Supreme Court for a minute. You know, we're gonna go into next year with either a 5-4 or a 6-3 Supreme Court, and in terms of a conservative majority. I actually think that strengthens our hand, because one thing that states have been very successful at doing is suing against regulations. So I do believe that we need a combination of a price on carbon and regulations. But for those people who think we should be a regulation-only response, knowing how long things dragged out in the court and that there's an unlikely chance of being successful in the Supreme Court, I think that actually solidifies our position of the importance of making sure that we get a price and that we get it right. I also want to just say something about this moment. I do feel for the Trump family. That's got to be incredibly stressful for them, and I do feel for all of them, and I hope they all make it through this okay. But then here we are. We're 30 days to election. Presidential years are nasty. Presidential election years. This year, no matter what the condition of Mr. Trump, is going to be rough from now to the election, but then the dust will settle. And there's we're a really simple shop. We do climate change. That's all we do. That's it. But I think that we also add a piece that we uniquely can work on, that I want to share something with you. And I'm going to wow some of you because I'm actually going to share my screen, something that some people think I can't do. I want to share something called our common purpose purpose, and reinventing American democracy for the 21st century. And let me see if I can minimize this so I can see. Okay, so this is a paper, but this is the conclusion of a paper by Danielle Allen, Stephen Heinz, and Eric Liu. It says the opportunity to participate in our constitutional democracy is, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., the chance to complete ourselves. Our best hope for human fulfillment lies in supporting and nurturing the political system that has been bequeathed to us, our constitutional democracy. Yet our ties to one another are fragile. The very institutions that should be the instrument of our freedom and the source of our protection appear to fail us. We do not trust them. We do not trust one another. In fear for and anxiety about our own prospects, we turn on one another. We starve our constitutional democracy of the nourishment it needs, closing our hearts to our fellow citizens. Why should we give our energies to one another again? Not to rebuild the republic as we knew it, not to restore can't see my screen, something that you could read. Our public sphere is full of disagreement in great measure because voices formerly excluded are now in the debate. The clamor and clash of our contests on, in this sense, a victory. We've made ourselves a bigger people, a more capacious and sometimes contradictory people, and therefore also a more resourceful people. The question now is whether we can find our way to accommodations with one another so that we can birth for ourselves a sense of shared fate. Ooh, screen causing problems. Sorry, people. To develop accommodations with one another, we need functional institutions for our joint decision-making. We can pick up this piece of work now together, but at the same time, we must also kindle a spirit of mutual responsibility in civic life, a humility that rehumanizes us. Our institutions and our norms will thrive only if we remember that democracy, when it works, is not a battle whose purpose is annihilation of the enemy. It is, if it works, a game of infinite repeat play that includes ever more participants. We must therefore remember how to work together, even with those we might want to demonize or ignore if we are to achieve this invention called for here. Uh-oh. Oh. Wow. Well, as if my screen does not want to go to the next screen. Let me try and.
I can open it and continue reading.
Okay, there's just the last slide.
The last slide, okay.
Yep.
Give me just half a second here. Okay, we have no time to waste. Our constitutional democracy is only as strong and resilient as our belief in it. For love of freedom and equality, for love of country, for love of one another, and out of hope for a better future, we need to reclaim our bond. If we turn back toward one another, we can transform our institutions. We can renovate our Constitution. We can elevate our culture. We can at last achieve a true democracy.
Great, Elizabeth, thank you for that. And thank you all so much for the invitation. I'm so happy that you'll be together today. Looking forward to a great conference. And again, thank you so much for including me. And again, it is so wonderful to see your faces. And I think I got in my 7-minute limit, Elizabeth.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, those were very appropriate words, Mark. Thank you for sharing that. I really love that. Well, now I'd like to welcome our first speaker today, Dr. Phil Sakimoto. Dr. Sakimoto is an astrophysicist and science educator who currently directs the program for academic excellence at the University of Notre Dame and teaches in the sustainability minor. He was formerly the program manager and acting director of space science education and public outreach for NASA. He is frequently engaged in educating the public about the science of climate change, and he is the co-creator of Let There Be Light, a planetarium program commissioned by the Vatican. He's also a member of CCL's South Bend chapter. Phil, thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, hi everybody. Glad to be here. I know it's not as much fun as being here in person, but we're going to do the best we can. So I do give a lot of talks about climate change, and usually I focus on the science of climate change, explain to people what is actually causing the problems, how all the disasters you all know about emanate from not only the warming of the planet, but the unevenness of the warming, and talk about what we need to do. But today we're going to do something a little bit different, mostly because this is what Elizabeth asked me to do. Just talk about changing the dialogue, words, action, and hope. And the first thing I want everyone to do is just take a deep breath. I know these are incredibly stressful times, but let's all imagine we're out there on that beach with my dog, Sundog. It's actually on the shores of Lake Superior, where it's peaceful and quiet, okay? And then we're gonna walk through three things here. We're gonna talk about how we use words to talk productively about climate change. We're talking actions. I'm gonna give you my personal sense of why this fee and dividend idea makes such good sense. I'm talking about how to find hope in what are sometimes rather depressing and desperate times. So we'll start with words. How do we speak to others constructively? And I want to take a tack that comes from something I actually talk about my students often, which is we have developed in our society a language that's very, I should say, non-productive. Far too often we hear people say, well, scientists say that, and fill in your favorite climate fact. And I hope none of you will ever say that again, because when you say scientists say, it creates this impression that this is a matter of somebody's opinion. Some scientists think that, others believe this. Scientists can have one idea, other people have another idea. It's all just opinions, which is how we get into these debates over clear scientific points. So we're going to get away from saying the scientists say business. It might be a little bit better to talk about the science says, because that's the point. But more specifically, the question is, what is the science? So let me pose a question in order to talk about what science really is. And the question is, why do rocks fall? Why do rocks fall? And if we were in person, I would now be picking on one of you to sort of work with me and try to answer this question. But with this many people on the line, we can't do that. So why do rocks fall? And many of you are sitting there going, well, it's gravity, right? Gravity makes things fall. Yeah, it is gravity. But what is gravity? And some of you are trying desperately to remember your high school science, and they're saying, well, gravity, it's a force, right? It's a force that pulls objects to the center of the earth. Okay, sure. But why does gravity do that? And then there would be a sudden silence, right? Because none of you can tell me why gravity does that. Well, guess what? I can't tell you why either. And neither can any physicist in the world tell you why. Because there's no why behind it. The rocks don't know about gravity. The rocks don't know about Isaac Newton. The rocks just know, so to speak, that when released, they fall. That's what they do. And the stuff we call the laws of gravity aren't really laws. They're just our observation of what things in nature do. So what science really is just the act of observing and describing what things in nature do. It tells us what they do, tells us how they do it, doesn't tell us why they do it. And sure, our descriptions can sometimes get very complex, very mathematical. They can be so good that we can predict future behavior in some instances. But it's just looking at what's there and saying carefully what it does. So when I hear someone say something like, well, I don't believe in climate change, I think, really? I mean, would you say, I don't believe in gravity? These aren't things you have a choice of believing or not. They just are. So we want to change the way we talk about this science. And to do that, we need to pause a minute and think about how scientists talk, which, by the way, is also not very helpful here. But in research science, we, of course, use a very technical language. We have very stringent criteria for what we say and do and what we don't say and don't do. And truth is come upon through a growing consensus among actually all the scientists in the world. To be a good research level scientist, you have to have a constant dose of skepticism. Well, that looks pretty good and the research looks pretty tight, but you know, there just might be this one other point we haven't thought of yet. And you always have to think that way. So what happens when we take a research scientist and put them in front of a TV camera and ask them a question about climate change? Well, they tend to talk in this obscure technical language that doesn't seem to reach a conclusion. Everyone thinks the scientists know what they're talking about. On the other hand, we have public science. And if you're going to speak about science to the public, you have to speak in a language that's very plain and clear. You have to talk about what we know, how we know it, how it affects us, say the things that people need to hear. Don't get wrapped up in saying the things you need to say when you're acting as a research scientist. So let's give an example. We had about a month ago now, Hurricane Laura, which you all know about, and which demolished the Mississippi coastline. And let's take our research scientist and ask that person, did climate change cause Hurricane Laura? Which is the kind of question TV people like to ask. And I imagine our research scientists would say, in fact, I heard some research scientists being interviewed saying things like this. Well, you know, when we take our global circulation model, we try to analyze a phenomenon as localized as a single hurricane. We really don't have the grid size to model something that small. So although it seems plausible that climate change might have been behind something like Hurricane Laura, we really can't demonstrate it through our models. So we actually don't know. So what did that scientist just say to the public? We don't know. That's the only thing the public understood, right? Now, if you put me in front of the TV interview and ask me, did climate change cause Hurricane Laura? I would say, that's the wrong question. Because climate change, or more specifically global warming, doesn't cause storms to form. Storms form from other processes. They always have and they always will, regardless of the state of climate change. But the correct question is, what impact did climate change have on Hurricane Laura? And here the answer is really clear, that when the ocean is warmer, which it is under our warming climate, the warm ocean surface drives more energy into a storm. It causes the storm to spin up much faster and stronger, and you have a hurricane. And oh, by the way, the fact that the air is warmer means that there's more moisture in the air, and though there's a lot more water to dump as rain. So we have big, strong wind flooding hurricanes. And that's probably what happened with Hurricane Laura. You know, it's what we expect in a warming climate, that more and more storms will spin up to become strong hurricanes and superstorms. Okay, did that sound plausible? Did that make sense? Was that true scientifically? Yeah, every word I said was true scientifically, but I said it for the public. So what I suggest to you as people who talk to many people in the public and in our political systems about climate change, don't fall back onto the scientists say business or the science says business. Just state the truth. Climate change is real. It is caused by our carbon-intensive lifestyles. It does threaten the health and safety and security of all of us. And that's wonderful, because the more times people say that simply as it is, state it like it's real, because it is. The more time TV commenters do that, and I've heard some doing it recently, which is wonderful, the more everyone begins to get the idea that this is just something that's real. But we do have to remember, as Mark was saying, that we have to also listen to the concerns of the others. We have to get to the bottom of their concerns. And so a word about listening actively. When someone comes up to you and says, well, I don't believe any of this climate change stuff, you know, don't take that bait. Ask them, why don't you believe it? And, you know, and then they'll tell you something. Well, there's all the science that's bogus. So what are some examples of bogus science? You see what I'm doing? I keep asking for more specifics about what they're getting at. And when you do that, basically one of two things will happen. either they'll begin to realize that they actually don't know the base of what they're saying and they'll start waffling or something, or they'll switch to something else. Maybe they'll tell you what they're really concerned about. For example, I was giving a talk on climate change once, and actually one of the first talks I gave years ago, and I gave it at my church. And unknown to me, but others who, friends of mine in the audience told me later that there were a couple of people from the Tea Party who had come on purpose in order to cause trouble. And they did afterwards ask questions that were trying to pull up some of this false science you hear about climate change. And that was not a big deal to me. I actually like it when that happens because I get to explain what's wrong with the science they're saying, what the real situation is. And although it may not convince them of what I'm saying, it certainly lets the rest of the audience understand how this false science works. But after the talk was over and after everyone left, except for one person who I learned later was one of the Tea Party people, and she came up to me privately when no one else was there and said, you know what? I know this climate change stuff is real. That picture you showed about the fires in Colorado, which was happening at that time, my daughter lives really close to where that fire is, and she almost lost her condo to it. So I know this is a real problem. But the thing that bothers me is I just don't want big government telling me what to do. Okay, great. Now we've gotten down to her actual concern. And so I just said to her, well, you know what? We don't need government to get involved in this. If you and I and everyone else just does the right thing, it'll be solved. And she sort of nodded and smiled a bit and went on her way. So that's great. You know, we got to a meeting of the minds and we were no longer enemies. At that point, though, you know, don't expect the other person to have an immediate change of heart, because they won't. But what happens is they'll go away and they'll think about it, and that might start causing a change of heart. You never know, but that's usually the way it works. All right. Let's move on to actions, or in particular, why the carbon fee and dividend. And this is my view on it. It's a view that comes from all the years I worked in Washington, D.C. And no, I didn't work in the Capitol. It's just a nice picture that illustrates, right, the heart of our nation's government. I worked at NASA headquarters, which is down the street a little bit from the Capitol. And at NASA headquarters, a lot of people don't even know NASA has a headquarters, but it's an office building in Washington, D.C., where we do program management over the work done at all the 10 NASA field centers scattered around the country. And it's also a place where we interface with the public and where we interface with Congress and the White House. So in my job there, and I was managing various education and diversity programs, but all of these programs are aimed at changing national behavior in the sphere in which I was working. From that, I came to realize very profoundly that when you're trying to change public behavior, especially on a national scale, prescriptive policies don't work. That is, a policy that says you must buy an electric car, or you have to have solar panels on that newly constructed house or whatever. They don't work because of the way the American people are. I mean, what do most people do when they hear about a rule like that? I have to do this. They get mad. They say, I'm not going to do it. No one tells me what to do. And then they spend all of their energy trying to figure out a way around the rule. Here's a loophole I can use. And so you tend to get nowhere. On the other hand, policies that set goals, provide incentives, but allow each person to decide how they're going to respond can be incredibly successful, right? So let me give you an example from my own world. One thing that I was doing was I was devising and managing a program when we were trying to bring minority students into NASA's science and engineering research. And there have been a lot of programs over the years that did that, and they threw a lot of money at the problem and they didn't have a whole lot of lasting success. So we devised a program that was kind of different. We said, well, we actually went out and asked people at minority institutions what would work. And they told us, well, of course, we need some money to do what we need, but we don't need that much money. And of course, we need to help you establish contacts with us with the NASA researchers and missions. Sure, we can do that. But then you need to get out of the way and let us devise the program because we know what works at our university and our community. So we did that, the very unusual thing of putting together a program that doesn't give prescriptive edicts on what you do, just says, here's the goal, tell us how you're going to make them. And you know what? The program is incredibly successful. We established new degree programs, new curricula at least a dozen different historical black colleges and tribal colleges and so forth. And just a couple examples, I have to brag a little bit, but these are things I really love. We have Native American students in Montana at Salish Kootenai Community College who are working on this picture. Is actually an old picture at the time, the thing we called the Mars Science Laboratory. It's now the thing you know as the Mars Curiosity rover, currently active on Mars. And we have these Native American students at a tribal college working on data reduction from one of the instruments on board that mission. And in another example, this young lady is or at least was at the time, a student at South Carolina State University in Orangeburg. She's developing instrumentation to use on a research quality astronomical telescope. And so it works. You give people the latitude to figure out what works best for them, and they do amazing things. So that's why I was so attracted to the carbon fee and dividend. It's the same thing, right? Yeah, you set up the fee and you give the dividend, which provides a monetary incentive, and everyone realizes that the fewer carbon emissions they create through their lifestyle, the less they got to pay in their portion of the fee, and they get the money for the dividend. So you got the economic incentive, and everyone's free to figure out how best to make use of it. And I think everything that's been said by CCL is absolutely right. This is going to cause a big sea change in how people behave. And the other good part is that if other sorts of more prescriptive regulations come along, people will want to go along with them. They'll say, ooh, here's an opportunity for me to save money by buying that electric car that I'm forced to buy anyway, but gas is so expensive now I don't want to buy gasoline anymore anyway, so let's go with it. So I think this really is the keystone that makes everything else work. I like the Growing Climate Solutions Act too for the same reason. It lets farmers decide for themselves how they're going to react, but it gives them a clear financial incentive. So with that, let me close by saying, where do we find hope? I mean, these acts are great if they get passed. We hope they'll get passed, but we don't know. I see a lot of things going on in other arenas that give me hope. In South Bend, we had a gathering of more than hundreds of people to talk about how we can make our city of South Bend become carbon neutral. And out of that, we had kids, young kids, giving hours of testimony to our city council, the South Bend Common Council, which the council members, as you can see, loved. And we now have a South Bend Climate Action Plan. I was told yesterday by a colleague who may be on the line here. If you are, it's Rachel Novak, Director of Notre Dame's Minor in Sustainability, who's told me that there's now a Jewish youth climate movement that's getting started, and that her own son Caleb is angling to be the leader and form a new chapter in South Bend, which is wonderful. We have students at Notre Dame who've done incredible research projects that have led to things like our Grind to Energy program, where we take the food waste from our dining halls, grind it up to this big thing we call a slurry, put it on a tanker truck where it goes out to Homestead Dairy Farm, where it goes into the biodigesters. And so that garbage becomes energy for powering farm equipment, making electricity, and the solid waste become bedding for their cows, and it's wonderful. So there's lots of little things that are very encouraging. They're cropping up in a lot of places. It makes me feel good to see them, but you got to ask, is it enough? I mean, we have a global problem. And there's a big gap between all of these small local solutions and getting the kind of widespread, huge global reduction in carbon emissions that we need to get. And that can be very, very discouraging. So I want to leave you with a lesson that came to be in a most peculiar way a few years ago. Maybe this is one of those things that can only happen if you work at Notre Dame. But there was a day when I heard the same homily from 3 different priests in the course of about an hour. It happened because on this day I was driving up to campus a bit late in the morning, and I had the radio on. I heard this verse from a priest on the radio. And I went to our magnificent basilica on campus and went to confession. And the priest in the confessional told me the same homily. So I walked out of there and sat down for the celebration of Mass in the basilica, and the priest celebrating the Mass gave his homily saying exactly the same thing. So I thought maybe this is something God wants me to listen to, particularly since in this homily, the fall guy is the Apostle Philip, my namesake. So, okay, you got my attention. Well, this homily was based on the story of the loaves and the fishes, which was the gospel reading for that day. And most of you are at least somewhat familiar with the story, but let's just go back through it for a second so we're on the same place. So in the story, right, Jesus is out preaching to a crowd of thousands of people, and Philip, the practical one, I'm very embarrassed because I realize I really do act like the Apostle Philip at times. So the Apostle Philip, the practical one, says, excuse me, Lord, Master, the people are hungry and we don't have any food to feed them, so why don't you just stop talking for a while and let them go into the village to buy food? This, by the way, is my translation, not exactly the words in the Bible. And Jesus says, well, no. And then this small child appears. It's a little boy in the story, and the little boy is holding a basket. In this basket are a couple fish and a few loaves of bread. And the little boy offers them to Jesus, saying, it's not much, but it's all that I have, and you can have it. And Philip, acting like Phillips do, says, well, that's just not going to work. It isn't enough. We've got thousands of people, and those couple of fish aren't going to feed them, and we're going to need a lot more. And Jesus tells him basically, shut up, sit the people down, and start serving them. So he and the other apostles do. And the end of the story is that there's plenty of food for everybody with leftovers. But the point of the homily is this. Who's the hero of the story? It's certainly not the Apostle Philip. No, the hero is the little boy. Because the little boy gave all that he had. He saw a big problem. He gave everything he possibly could. And then he trusted in the Lord to fill in the rest. So this is the question we have to ask ourselves. Has each of us given all that we have, all that we can to solve this problem? Have we done everything we can in our personal lives to clean up our carbon act? And that's really important, not only for our contribution, but because our friends and neighbors are looking at us. And when they see what we're doing, many of them will follow suit. So we really have to act in a way that we're practicing what we're asking the world to do. That gives us credibility. That gets the ball rolling. And I sincerely hope that it gives all of us the hope that if we just, each one of us, gives and does everything we can, that the Lord will fill in the rest, and we're going to get out of this. So let me end this monologue here and come back live and see what you folks out there have to say or want to ask or think about all this.
Thank you, Phil. I want to just let people know to please direct questions in the chat to Catherine Garten. She's one of our co-hosts. So if you will find her and chat her any questions that you have. And I apologize that we did not make that clear. That was a misunderstanding on my part. All right, so Phil, you've been studying this, paying attention to this issue, working on this issue for a good number of years. What kinds of, changes have you seen, and what gives you hope right now?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that more and more people are realizing and confessing that climate change is a real issue. When I first started doing these talks on climate change, which was, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago now, most of the talk was aimed at convincing people that climate change was real. I spent a lot of time, going really deep into what we actually know and what the impacts are and like that. Now, I've learned, especially the questions I get, that what people really want to know is, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? What do we do about it? So I've been gradually changing the content of my usual talks, going much more quickly through the background and spending a lot more time on what kinds of solutions we need and what are the most important ones and how can we get there. And now you can get ready to smile. I now close my talks with a couple of your slides and talk about the fee and dividend.
That's great. We always love that. Thank you. Catherine, do we have some questions in the chat that you can share?
Yes, we have a lot of questions in the chat, which is wonderful. I'm just trying to sort of synthesize some of them. So one question is that it's great that a lot of people aren't debating the climate science as much anymore, but what would you say to someone who believes that climate change is real, that it's human caused, but that it's not as urgent as people are making it seem? How would you respond to something like that?
Well, you hear a lot of people talking about how we've got 14 years to act or 10 years to act, or we have to keep the warming to less than 1.5 degrees, or wait, maybe it's 2 degrees, or maybe it's... And you have to understand that all of those limits are really, I'm going to say bogus. I mean, it's not that they're false, but they're misleading. They're arbitrary markers that someone put up there, But the fact of the matter is that climate change is already out of hand. Not a day goes by when there's not a major storm, flood, or fire somewhere in the news or somewhere, in our own country. And so the time for action is right now. I mean, of course, we all know it was decades ago, but this is the kind of crisis where you really have to drop everything and put all your attention into getting it right. Because every day we don't reduce our carbon emissions, we are pushing the warming to go a lot faster and making it that much harder to catch up with it. Here's a fun fact that you might want to file away in your CCL memory banks. For every 10 years that we delay taking action to reduce carbon emissions, for every 10 years that we delay, the peak temperature is going to be a half a degree higher. That's the impact of delay. Because all the time we're delaying, we're just pumping more carbon up there. That's going to make it get hotter.
Awesome, thank you. So a few more questions here. One of them is, how do you balance that sense of urgency with the hope that you talked about as well in your messaging? How do you bring the two of those together?
The thing that makes people feel good is that they can do something about it, right? And so before we get around to talking about the wonderful national or global fee and dividend, I show them the things that everyone can do, right? All the things you know about, but I show them, and I've learned this, I show them the solar panels on my house, I show them my own hybrid car, I show them my wonderful dog, who's always the star of the show, carrying a plastic bottle to recycling bin. Because The thing that makes you feel hopeless is if you feel powerless. Okay? And so I encourage people to do these things. I encourage them to understand that every time one of them does it, like I already said to you, it encourages others to do the same thing, and it creates a mindset, right? And the other thing that you have to realize that most people don't is all the stuff that people say about what makes the government act is mostly false. It's not big business. It's not the big lobbyists. It's not the ironclad political, persuasions, stereotypical things they do. It's not. The number one thing that everyone in Washington, everyone in office in Washington thinks about is only this. What do the people back home in my district, in my state, think? Okay, and I would tell you that behind closed doors, I got used to having meetings with congressional staffers. We're talking about this big program we want to roll out in NASA and all the reasons why you ought to support it when we put it in our legislative request. And the staffer will say, that's a great idea. I really like it. But you know what? I'm pretty sure the voters back in fill in the blank of their home district won't go for it. So I can't recommend it to my congressman. And there it is. So when the day comes that the majority of people in the United States are actively saying we need to take strong action on climate change, everything that happens in Washington is going to change overnight. Okay? So it really is the sum of all the little voices that makes the difference.
Thanks. And you sort of along the way answered another question, which had been coming up a few times about how to get our members of Congress to prioritize climate legislation. And it sort of, I feel like you answered that eloquently.
Yeah, but I want to add to a little bit.
Yeah,
When you work in Washington, if you get 200 letters on some subject, that's a landslide of letters. All right. So all the lobbying and all the letter writing really does have an impact. But you need to couple that with the sense that it's not just you saying that, it's everybody. You're just speaking for everybody. Then the action will come.
One sort of quick clarification question that I've had a couple people ask about is just that half degree that you mentioned earlier for every year of inaction. Was that in Celsius or Fahrenheit?
Celsius. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And then we've had a few questions about just wanting you to maybe elaborate on the intersection between sort of science and the scientific facts and faith, given some of like the homily that you mentioned, and how to sort of communicate with people across both of those fields.
Well, we have, of course, the greatest thing that's ever been written on that subject, which is Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si, Care for a Common Home, which does, frankly, the best job of laying out the environmental issues and climate change issues that I have seen in any publication for lay people. And it's very accurate and very honest. But then he also talks about how the real root of the problems, I mean, yes, it is that we live a very materialistic, carbon-rich lifestyle, sure. But the deeper question is, why do we do that? Because it's rooted in our culture and our desire for material goods and so forth, our greed, basically. And so, in his view, changing the way lowering our carbon emissions really starts from changing our basic lifestyles so that we can lead simpler lives, we can be more generous to others, we can be not so greedy about needing all this stuff. And so first of all, to anyone who asks that question, please read all of Laudato Si and then talk about it to people, because people of all religious faiths hear it. I was in Kazakhstan doing this project for the Vatican, and it was part of the Vatican's exhibition at an international expo about Laudato Si and climate change and the use of energy. And at that exhibit, the priest in charge of the exhibit was handing out copies of Laudato Si, and people of all faiths loved it. We had a Muslim, a high official from one of the Arab oil nations, jumping up and down in excitement, saying, "This is the best thing I've ever read," pointing out that this is God's creation. Now we have to take care of it. It's wonderful, just wonderful. So that's the message. It's there.
Elizabeth, how many more questions do we have time for, would you say?
I think we probably have time for at least one more, maybe two.
Okay, great. So we've had some questions come in that are sort of asking about what you mentioned about prescriptive legislation versus legislation that creates incentives and goals, and sort of wondering, will it be enough to simply create incentives and goals when there's so much behavior change that needs to happen? And then other questions have come in saying, will even the policy that we've proposed now be considered as an overreach by some people? So you have kind of two sides asking that question, and I'm wondering how you address that.
Okay, well, for the overreach question, I leave that to your wonderful legislative experts in CCL. Is it enough? No. It's the first step that gets everything rolling, okay? There are certain things that need to be done by national policy that can't be done any other way. The biggest of which is rebuilding our national electricity grid so that we can actually shove all this renewable energy from place to place, right? The other kinds of things that will help need to come from the federal government, more tax incentives for buying electric cars or putting up solar panels, that kind of thing. There's a whole wealth of things that are being proposed by the progressive side of our political spectrum, all of which would be helpful if they were passed and were presented in a way that was palatable. And as I said, the big thing that the fee and dividend will do is it will encourage people to want stuff like that because they understand the benefit, not the benefit to the planet, but the benefit to their own wallet, which is in the end, the only thing that really matters to most people, right? So I think they go together, but I really, really keep going back to, this is a linchpin. We got to get this fee and dividend in place. It makes everything else possible and palatable.
Okay, I think we'll probably stop there, Phil. Thank you so much. That was really great, and appreciate the support and the endorsement for carbon fee and dividend and all that you do. All right, so this is wrapping up this first session, but before you leave, let me share where you're going next. And Catherine will be also putting in the chat where you're going. And Catherine, if after you paste that in, I know some folks were interested in Mark's quote. We will get that to you. And I did share with Catherine a website for this group called Our Common Purpose that is working together on these documents related to what Mark shared earlier. So to go to your state breakout sessions, you'll be able to just click on the link for your state in the chat, and it'll take you, you'll leave here and you'll go right there. Or you can refer to your email, or if you are on an app, like on your phone or tablet, the meeting ID and passcodes are here on the screen. Your sessions will start at 10 minutes after the hour, right, everybody? Sorry, having a hard time remembering. Yep, 10 minutes after the hour sharp. And then your state breakout host will put a link back to this line. Unless you're Indiana, if you're Indiana, stay right here. Everybody else, you're going somewhere else, but you'll get a link to come back here for our closing session with Tia Nelson and Bob Inglis. So enjoy your break. Thanks very much.